Welcome back. You like my new music? This is Galatians music. Yeah, today we are going to begin a new study on the book of Galatians, the ninth book in the New Testament. Galatians is one of my favorites. I remember fairly early on in my walk with the Lord, I stumbled onto the book and it corrected a lot of my just bad thinking and bad theology. Galatians was written by the Apostle Paul to the churches in the province of Galatia. Today we know it as southern Turkey. We're given some background of the churches beginning in Acts chapter 13 through 19, through 13 and 14. These were churches begun by Paul when he was on his first missionary journey. Well, he was traveling with Barnabas into the cities of Antioch and Iconium and Derbe and Lystra. All of these cities were cities in the province of Galatia. And the Apostle Paul wrote Galatians from the city of Corinth. He wrote it to address the legalism that had found its way into the church. Legalism is requiring someone to perform in a certain way to attain God's acceptance. We call it justification, or as someone once said, just as if I'd never sinned. Of course, some people don't like that definition because they think it detracts from what Jesus did on the cross to procure our acceptance before God. But these false teachers, really, they were more like confused teachers. Were teaching this legalism, and they just come out of Judaism, and so and the Jews had just kind of screwed up God's teaching on justification and knowing the difference between it and sanctification, which we'll talk about in this book. But these teachers, along with none other than the Apostle Peter, were teaching legalism as they visited various churches, one in particular, the one that was in the province at Galatia. So we'll see what Paul gets. We'll see that Paul gets into the face of Peter in chapter 2 in order to address Peter's legalistic tendencies. And we'll talk about why we do that kind of thing. We all have certain proclivities toward certain things, and we'll talk about that. Again, Paul wrote this letter to confront those who were confused about justification. You see, these men had come to Galatia from Jerusalem, teaching that what Paul calls heresy in chapter 1. To be more specific, these confused teachers were teaching that in order to be real Christians, the Gentiles who had become believers would have to be circumcised. They would have to keep the law of Moses, and they would have to obey all the Old Testament rituals. Of course, one of the points of the law is to point out to us that we can't be good enough. And we'll talk about all this as we work through the book. And to substantiate his point, Paul uses Abraham to teach good biblical theology. You know, I think that's at the root of everything that is a whack in our lives, our bad theology. Paul writes in Galatians that Abraham was given the promise of justification by faith 400 years before the law was given. Of course, the law is teaching on sanctification. The law cannot change the promise. They're different. Their roles are different. Their purposes are different. The purpose of the law was different than the purpose of justification. And this is where most heresy comes from. People confuse the two, justification and sanctification. And again, as we work through the book of Galatians, we'll make the difference clear. Have you ever noticed every religion in the world requires good behavior, good works to be made right with God, or justification? except Christianity. That is, if you would call Christianity a religion. I don't do that because it's totally different. It's really a relationship initiated by God. Religion is man's hand reaching up to heaven. Christianity is God's hand reaching down from heaven to rescue man. Hinduism teaches renunciation of the world and that one must become one with the spirit of the universe. Buddhism teaches 8 principles by which man lives and thus find himself on the way to salvation. Islam says that a man must pray 5 times a day and give alms and fast on the month of Ramadan and obey the commands of Allah. You see, in every one of those religions, salvation is said to be achieved by something we do. Not so with Christianity. So Paul concludes the book of Galatians in an interesting way. He concludes it with the portrait of a spiritual man. Interesting, because throughout this book you'll see teachings on justification and sanctification. He begins by addressing having a proper understanding of justification. He ends with the proper understanding of sanctification. I love chapter 6 of Galatians. It's the portrait of the spiritual man. I can't wait to get there. The overall main theme in the book of Galatians is freedom, which is the whole point of our sanctification, as you'll see. So I'm looking forward to this new study. I close with a quote from the late Mike Yaconelli, which I find very appropriate to share with you at this point. He said, "Accepting the reality of our broken, flawed lives is the beginning of spirituality, not because the spiritual life will remove our flaws, but because we let go of seeking perfection and instead seek God, the one who is present in the tangledness of our lives." My friend, I trust that these podcasts are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If you have any questions or if you'd just like to connect, you can send me an email at beyoungministry@gmail.com. Hey, I trust you have a great day.